Several years ago, I completed a History MA with the Open University. The subject of my dissertation was the work of Blackpool Corporation's Advertising Committee between 1890 and 1930. One of the topics I covered as context was the size of seaside resorts, with population taken as a measure of the size of the resort. I also looked briefly at how the size of resorts mapped against the arrival of the railway in the resort. The two main sources which I used are John K. Walton's The English Seaside Resort, A Social History 1750 to 1914. Walton's book includes population tables for the largest seaside resorts in England and Wales at various dates. I also used RVJ Butts, The Directory of Railway Stations. This slide and the next two slides show the 30 largest seaside resorts in England and Wales in 1851. I have included a column for the location of the resorts in terms of current regions. I apologise for classing Wales as a region. 13 of the resorts are in the southeast, including 2 on the Isle of Wight, 9 in the southwest, 3 each in the east and Yorkshire and the Humber, and 1 each in the northwest and Wales. The southeast resorts are, of course, relatively close to London and in some cases accessible to Londoners by sea, so their growth will have predated the arrival of the railways in some cases. Southport, the sole northwest resort in the top 30, is on this slide. By 1881, it was 5th in the overall rankings and still the largest resort in the northwest. However, by 1911, it had fallen to 8th overall and been overtaken by Blackpool as the largest resort in the northwest. 3 of the 9 resorts in the southwest are on this slide. It is interesting to note that none of the resorts are in Cornwall, with 6 being in Devon, 2 in Dorset, and 1 in Somerset. In 1851, Whitby was the second largest resort in Yorkshire and the Humber, behind Scarborough but ahead of Bridlington, which was also the case in 1881. But by 1911, not only Bridlington but also Cleethorpes had outgrown Whitby. Aberystwyth, the only Welsh resort in the top 30, is on this slide. It was still the largest resort in Wales in 1881. However, by 1911, it had been eclipsed in size, not just by Penarth in South Wales, but also by Colwyn Bay, Llandudno and Rhyl on the North Wales coast. The third largest resort in the east, Harwich, which is in Essex, is also on this slide. Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft, approximately 10 miles apart either side of the Norfolk-Suffolk border, with Lowestoft being the most easterly settlement in the UK, are on earlier slides. Historians are divided in terms of the impact of the railways on visitor numbers to the seaside. In Besides the Seaside, James Wolvin cites the Railway Act 1844 and also excursion trains as significant in reducing the cost of travel by train, whilst in The Englishman's Holiday, J.A.R. Pimlott identifies other cheap facilities and the parliamentary trains at a penny a mile as key developments. However, in The Tourist Gaze, John Ury notes that the railway companies did not seriously promote travel in specific resorts until the end of the 19th century, whilst in Selling Places, Stephen V. Ward says that typically they brought big increases in absolute numbers of visitors, but most are simply day trippers. The correlation between resort size and the arrival of the railway in resorts is certainly observable on this graph. Of the 30 largest resorts in 1851, the railway had arrived in 20 by then, including in the largest 10 resorts. There is a clustering of points in the bottom left area of the graph where the resorts are largest and the railway arrived earliest. Of the 10 resorts without a station by 1851, 5 were in the southwest, 3 were in the southeast, including 2 on the Isle of Wight, with 1 each being in the east and Wales. Of course, correlation is not necessarily causation, and in some instances, the early growth of a resort was not linked to the arrival of the railway. In the role of landowners, entrepreneurs, and railways in the urban development of the North Wales coast during the 19th century, Alan Fletcher writes that a sizable tourist trade could predate the coming of the railways, citing Blackpool, Llandudno, and Rhyl as examples. In the later Kentish Seaside, Felicity Stafford and Nigel Yates note the early development of Kent's resorts through their accessibility from London by hoy, coach, and steamboat. Fletcher also identifies instances such as Colwyn Bay, where even once the railway had arrived, landowning elites could still stifle development. There are, though, clear examples where development was hindered by the late arrival of the railway, with Sue Farrant citing Bognor and Seaford as such resorts in London by the Sea. Using Walton's analysis, it is interesting that Bournemouth, which by 1911 was the second largest resort in England and Wales, with a population of 78,674, had a population of less than 700 in 1851, putting it 69th in the size rankings, rising to 15th in 1881 with a population of almost 17,000 following the opening of the first train station in the town in 1870. My final slide focuses on Blackpool. Again, using Walton's analysis, in 1851, Blackpool was the 43rd largest seaside resort in England and Wales, with a population of over 2,500, rising to 20th in 1881 with a population of almost 13,000, and then to 4th in 1911 with a population of 58,371. Walvin noted increased numbers of visitors to Blackpool once the line to Fleetwood had opened in 1840, before the first station opened in Blackpool 6 years later. However, Walton claims that far from stimulating traffic, the railway companies struggled to keep pace with Blackpool's expansion. It does seem likely that the opening of the first train station in Blackpool in 1846 was a factor in the town's growth between 1851 and 1881. But the massive expansion of Blackpool between 1881 and 1911 owed much to the passing of the Blackpool Improvement Act in 1879. The Act gave the corporation the power to spend 2p in the pound on the borough's rateable value on advertising the attractions of the town. In general, rival seaside resorts were denied powers to spend the rates on advertising themselves until 1921. Much of the revenue generated through the rates was spent on annual poster campaigns, brochures, the early illuminations, and events such as carnivals. But this Midland Railway poster, dated from the early 1890s, demonstrates the railway companies also invested heavily in advertising Blackpool.